quick to do, partly because we know each other. It's a way of leveraging our friendships, because we've certainly had this experience working on the wine supply chain, where people know their region very well. They know, Sergio knows all of the wine producers here, as does Alejandro in Chile, but we in the United States may have better knowledge of the market there. And when we work together, we bring something that no single participant in the wine supply chain has. So we've been able to leverage this, and I'll go over this rather more quickly because most of the people in this room know all about this right now because you're participating in it. So the wine supply chain is a group of us that we've been looking at the shipment of wine into the United States from all of the great wine producing regions of the world. And we've done this by teaming up. We've been, here are the routes we've been following. And we've done this by teaming up, in which people in the wine producing regions work with the wineries to put the data logger in the shipment. And so we retrieve these in the United States and then return the information back to our colleagues in the wine producing regions. Now, this has produced a huge amount of very valuable information. We now, as a group, have more knowledge of the temperature inside of shipping containers than anybody else. I have talked with Jay Hillebrand, for example, with their head of operations. They advertise that they know temperatures. But when pressed, he admitted to me that the temperature that they have are not shipping container temperatures. All they did was get temperatures from weather.com. Okay? So they can tell you what the temperature was someplace outside, but that's very different than, they're reporting more like climate. We have a history of more than 1,000, correct me if I get the numbers wrong here, Alejandro, of more than 1,000 shipments. Okay, so we can tell you what the temperature was inside the shipping container, and that's quite different. We have something of value. And we've all built this database together. It's now at the point, I think, where it's possible to get participants in the supply chain quite interested. In fact, Alejandro has been able to secure funding from a major wine distributor in the United States, who now fund his research. So this can be a generator of research funds. This is the kind of information, of course, you've all seen this before. But here is how Alejandro has managed to turn this into something even bigger. And it's going to change in ways that they no longer have control. So this is something that, we'll talk more about this when the Wine Supply Chain Council meets, but nobody else has done anything like this before. I was shocked that Jay Hillebrand had not been measuring temperatures in the containers. And they're the most likely group, I think, to have done so. So we know something that other people don't. And furthermore, we can make this of value immediately to winemakers, but also to the wine purchasers, say the importers. The ones that we've talked to in the United States have been very interested because they might have tasted that wine back at the winery. And they're very curious to know, well, what is it going to taste like when it actually reaches me? Okay, so an opportunity. More about international logistics. Just because here's probably the biggest change in international logistics that we'll see in many years, which is the widening of the Panama Canal. And so you can see here the Panama Canal. Where's all the population? Most of the population in the U.S. is, of course, on the East Coast. If you're shipping fresh produce out of Chile, you pretty much have to go through the Panama Canal. The alternative is to take it to the West Coast, put it on a train, and send it back here to the population centers. Okay, so Chile is going through the Panama Canal for most of their product. Okay, well, what's going to happen when the Panama Canal is widened? How will the trends in modern shipping affect the transport of fresh produce? So again, this is the kind of information we can bring into the food supply chains, where people who produce the food this may not be the first thing on their mind. They may not be thinking ahead of, well, how is the Panama Canal going to ship by transport of fresh peaches from Chile to New York? Basically what happens is stuff from Chile is going to come here, and the ship will either go through the canal, or it will offload, put the containers on, refrigerated containers on a train, which will come here and it'll be loaded again and go. So it would be very useful, I would think, for people moving this fresh and vulnerable produce to know exactly what goes on here. So this is information that we can share and think about with the shippers. For example, here's some of the things that were a surprise to me. One is currently it's possible to get at most 52 ships a day through the canal in each direction. 52 ships. And part of the reason is that the canal is actually like a road, one lane of which is closed for construction. It's because of the Galliard cut here. It's very narrow. And so because of that, the ships queue up for about 8 hours. 8 to 12 hours, they just queue up. And then they open the lane and those ships all go in one direction. And so this reduces, of course, the throughput of the canal. This is not going to change very much even after the widening of the canal. So that's not going to solve anything. There's also something going on just in shipping here, the movement to larger container ships. And basically all the big liner companies are losing money. Hapag-Lloyd lost something like $1 billion last year. And in an effort to reduce those losses, what they're trying to do is ship more efficiently. And the way they're doing that is building bigger container ships. Okay, well that's going to affect the shipment of fresh produce. I'm not exactly sure how, but it's going to have some profound effect on it. The reason that the shipping companies are building bigger ships is because you build a bigger ship, it only costs a little bit more to operate, but you can carry many more containers, and that's of course how they make the revenue. And so after the Panama Canal is widened, it will accept ships that are 20% longer, but 3 times the capacity. And those ships are already built, and bigger ones. Now, if the ship is 20% longer, that means you can only have 20% more cranes working on it. Okay? But it has 3 times the capacity. So what that says is that when you park that ship to be worked at the port, it's going to be in port longer. That means that your fresh produce is going to be sitting at its most vulnerable for a longer time. That means it's going to take longer for you to get that fresh produce to market if it's going on these big ships. So more expensive port calls. From the point of view of the shipping company, they've got only, as I see it, 3 different options. One is they can sail with less than a full load, but that defeats the whole purpose of them making the bigger ships. So they're not going to do this. They can sail less frequently. They might do this where they can get away with it, which means that your fruit may not get on a ship when you want it to. Or they may change to a different pattern here, a hub and spoke pattern, where they bring the big ships in, offload them, transship the product, which means additional handling in another day of delay. So this is my guess as to what's going to happen. And to some extent, this is already going on now. Here is the port of Balboa, so this is the Pacific side of the Panama Canal. And we get a lot of fresh fish from Asia coming to the U.S. And here's what happens to it. These are ships that are too big now to go through the Panama Canal. And so what they're doing is they're unloading, this Maersk ship unloaded 5,000 containers. 5,000 containers, 5,000 TEUs, I should say. The biggest ships that can go through the Panama Canal now are about 4,500 TEUs. So this one's unloading 5,000 TEUs, put on the train to go across and then be transshipped. But all of this is going to take an additional half day here, half a day, a full day on the train, another half day to be loaded. And this sort of thing is going to be more common, I believe, with the larger ships. Here's a number of graphs that we see a lot of. This is about where the market is. We want to know that because when we're sending fresh fruit, where should we be sending it? How should we be getting it there? These graphs I've taken from various publications that purport to show that if you're sending product, this is focusing on Asia, so we'll talk about Asia first. If you're sending product from Asia, on the left here, it's easier to go into a West Coast port than put it on a train. If you go through the Panama Canal, the green is where you want to come in. That's cheapest to serve here, and this is sort of a no man's land. It's equal cost. Here's a similar graph. A different organization is drawn, and the effect of widening of the Panama Canals is going to make it cheaper per container to get product to the East Coast, and so it's going to move this line back a little bit. Okay, so I thought these pictures were kind of interesting, and have done something similar, but in a little bit more detail. Here's the population density of the United States. If you're exporting, you can see that this is the East Coast where most people live. We're kind of on the edges, but the East Coast is the population-rich area. If you're coming from Asia, you've got the decision of, do I want to convey it by train? Here is what's called a Voronoi diagram, which is a mathematical structure that has divided the map up into regions that are closest. Every point in this region, this little polygon here, the closest port is Los Angeles. Okay, and so this structure basically divides North America up into regions associated with the port that is closest to them. And one way of thinking about this is these are sort of the natural market regions. These are the ones where it's least expensive to get product to the port. Now, if I look at coming from Asia, the import of fresh fish from Asia, well, I should point out this, sorry. This dividing line says that everything here, it's better to come into a West Coast port. And then everything here is better to come into an East Coast port. If I add the cost now of coming from Asia, for example, Shanghai, the graph looks slightly different. It's shifted this way. Because I'm coming from Shanghai, the region in which I'm coming into a West Coast port makes more sense, it's much larger. And you can see this greatly increases the market. If I look at coming from Europe, it shifts back the other way. So all of these areas, it's better to come into an East Coast port. This much smaller region, it's better to come into a West Coast port. And if I look at coming from Valparaiso, here's how it divides up. So we've done exactly the same thing. And you can see that this includes, so here we are coming right up the Panama Canal into the East Coast, and it includes all of the population centers, the great population density of the United States. Now, there's one thing I don't show on this. All I had to work with here were transportation costs. What I'd really like to know are transportation times. Because then I can produce a picture that looks like this, and I can talk about the boundaries here. Because the boundaries are the extreme. If I come into the port of Savannah, for example, the boundaries here are the ones that are the furthest markets that I would want to supply from Savannah. And that means that there's basically where the quality problems will assert themselves. All right, so I want to see where are the quality problems. Okay, so this is more about international logistics than it is about food, but then when you put them two together, I think you get some new questions. that I haven't seen other people ask before. So this seems to me to be a possible research area. Here I've done something similar just to look at the distribution of wine. I was interested, we learned from Kike during our wonderful meeting in Mendoza that in fact the wine production there largely goes out of San Antonio or Valparaiso. And so this is the dividing point where it makes sense. And so you'll have to help me here with the geography, but it looks to me like Mendoza is right about here, right? Okay, so you really could make an argument for, I mean, it makes sense to send possibly out of Buenos Aires or either of these because it's right on the dividing line. Okay, so I've mentioned a bunch of ideas. How do you proceed on these? Partly because my style of research is start simple and then add complications. It seems to make sense to me to focus on specialty foods. We've done this with wine, besides the obvious reason of its enjoyability, for the fact that it is much easier than, say, fresh peaches or something of that sort. High value because we know there will be players in the supply chains that are interested in the results. Relatively simple patterns of perishability, and this is partly because otherwise the laboratory problem becomes so complicated. We'd like to have